Hello, I'm Katty Kay in Washington.
And I'm Carlos Watson in California.
And welcome to When Katty Met Carlos,
a new podcast exploring how America is reshaping its future, brought to you by the BBC World Service and OZY Media.
So, Carlos, I'm sorry I have missed you for a couple of weeks, but I hope that you had a good Thanksgiving holiday.
I ate way too much, and I missed you as well, and glad that you were back safely.
Yeah, I spent my Thanksgiving flying on a flight back from Cyprus and then arrived having asked my children to prepare Thanksgiving meal, and we got Chinese takeout.
Be careful. They might tell you they upgraded.
Yeah. I think they thought that was an improvement on dried out turkey that I usually offer them. But I see that things have been keeping busy here in America during my absence.
Plenty going on the political front, sadly on the COVID front, and so much more. But one way or another, we're moving towards the end of the year.
Yeah, that could not come soon enough. And nor could that vaccine, by the way.
I'm hopeful.
Look, we've covered a lot of big topics during the course of this time that we have spent together on this podcast and this radio show. And one of the ones that you and I spoke about right at the beginning that we wanted to talk about was the issue of policing in America. Because as everybody in the world watched during this past year, the death of George Floyd back in July, after he was arrested outside a store in Minneapolis, Minnesota, exposed something that African-American communities had known for a very long time about police brutality and inequality and treatment in this country, but I think was a wake-up call to white people living in this country.
Yeah, I thought that video of the police officer, Derek Chauvin, kneeling on George Floyd's neck, pinning him to the ground for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, of George Floyd calling out in his final minutes for his mother was heartbreaking, devastating, powerful, and in quite a way, I think, really opened up a fresh and needed conversation on race and on police reform as well.
Yeah, I mean, it was another of those standard encounters, a minor incident between a police officer and a member of the public, which spiraled unnecessarily, tragically out of control.
And sadly, it's a tragically familiar tale, especially when it comes to police and black and brown communities. Indeed, as one of this week's guests, Leon Ford, sadly found out firsthand back in 2012.
The night was November 11th. It was a Sunday, so I was actually headed from my uncle's house to my grandmother's house. And during that drive, I was actually driving down a one-way street the correct way, where I seen a police officer driving the wrong way up the one-way. And so when we kind of crossed paths with one another, we locked eyes. And I knew that they were going to stop me. Although I didn't break any laws, I just kind of felt it. My intuition told me. And they turned their lights on. I immediately pulled over, provided my driver's license, registration. One of the officers snatched my credentials, and I immediately knew that, this is going to be a long traffic stop. I didn't have any warrants or anything, so my name came back clear. But instead, they insisted that I was lying about my identity. I was nervous, as a 19-year-old. I was definitely nervous. And so when the officers reached through my window and I unlocked the door, the other grabbed my shoulder. When they did that, I decided to drive off. I didn't realize that they called backup and there was another officer on my passenger side. And so the officer on my passenger side jumped into my vehicle and he immediately started to fire. And so I was shot 5 times, point blank range. And I just remember, thinking man, I don't want to die, I remember the officers searching my car while I was on the ground, where's the drugs, where's the guns? And I would say, I don't have any drugs, I don't have any guns, why'd you shoot me? Why'd you shoot me? And I just remember the ambulance coming and I tried my best to stay awake. I just remember fading out. And, I woke up in the hospital. I remember, the doctor saying, we have good news and we have bad news. The good news is you are going to survive. The bad news is you will never walk again.
Leon, my heart breaks when I hear your story. How do you feel 8 years later, not only as you think about your own story, but when you see George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and sadly so many others? What comes to your mind here in late 2020?
Well, the first thing that comes to my mind is there's work to be done. And I'm so grateful and fortunate that there are people around the country that are doing the real work. Activists, politicians, there are police officers committed to this work. And so I just, try to focus on that and not so much and focusing on the pain and the suffering of so many people.
Also joining this conversation, we have Reddit Hudson, a former St. Louis police officer. Now he's the co-founder of the National Coalition of Law Enforcement Officers for Justice, Reform and Accountability. And joining us from Texas is Chief Art Acevedo. He is the City of Houston Police Department's chief. Welcome to both of you. Thank you for joining the program.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Yeah.
Chief Acevedo, I want to start with you in Houston, Texas. When you hear Leon's story, what's your reaction to it?
Well, it's a mix of emotions. Leon, when you listen to him speak, you don't hear hatred or condemnation of the entire police profession. And as a matter of fact, he's just a special soul that actually acknowledges that there's good people, activists, elected officials, and police officers that are working on it to make the profession better. But I just want to tell Leon, I'm sorry for what happened to you, but I am grateful that God spared your life, so your very powerful voice and spirit can be part of this conversation.
Thanks, Chief.
Reddit Hudson, I want to bring you in. Tell us a little bit about your experience as a police officer. Is it, as many have said, just a few bad apples that we need to address in order to have a healthier and more effective police force, or do you think there is something more fundamental that needs addressing?
Listening to Leon, I'm struck, as I always am, by how nothing has changed. This is generations old, man. My father's father's father, and everyone in the community along that lineage can tell you about abused police power. In my own experience, man, I was a police officer here in St. Louis, annually one of the most dangerous cities in the United States of America. We also have one of the most violent police forces in the United States of America. In my experience, you often hear it thrown out that there's just a few bad apples, but that doesn't reflect the reality of our experience. And I think more and more people are becoming aware of that experience because of cell phones and other video recording devices providing objective records of how those encounters look more often than people realized in the past. Relative to how many officers need to be addressed, I've got a colleague who's a training officer in St. Louis. He says this, and I have to agree with him, that on any given day in a major city in the United States of America, you've got 15% of your officers on that city's department who are going to do the right thing all the time. You've got 15% of your officers who are going to abuse their authority at every chance they get. That leaves 70% of your officers that could go either way, depending on the situation and who wields the most influence inside the culture of that department. And all too often, it's those officers who will abuse their power, who exert the most influence on the departments. So it's more than just a few bad apples, and we do need deep systemic change in this country to address abused police power.
Art, I know that you've been working very hard in Houston to try to reform the department that you are the chief of. Leon was shot 8 years ago this month. The officer who shot him is still on the police force. Is the police force in America still doing the same things it was doing 8 years ago to Leon, that it's more than just a few bad apples?
Well, I've changed the lexicon of the way I speak about these issues because we've always said a few bad apples, and I've changed that to bushels of apples because while the majority are still good officers, I agree with what he's saying that, a good percentage wants to know what are the expectations. And we've heard the term of awful but lawful in terms of use of deadly force, and too often those lawful but awful incidents are tolerated. If it's that awful, officers should be held accountable for awful uses of force. And I think that ultimately we need to hold police leaders accountable who fail to hold bad police officers accountable.
Leon, I want to bring you in here because one of the things that Reddit is mentioning is that there's often a racial divide in how people look at this. What do you hear from friends or acquaintances who are white? What's been your experience in terms of how people who are not black receive your story?
So it has changed over time. Closer to like 2012 to, let's say, 2015, people would say, well, what did you do? But there was a shift. And I think, the Black Lives Matter movement had a lot to do with that shift. Pretty much changed from people looking at me like I did something wrong to people kind of asking the question, what did the officers do wrong? What is going on? And there has to be something wrong.
Reddit, do you think that conversation in of itself, the way that Leon says he is received differently in 2020 than he was even a year or two ago, is that enough to help change the policing culture that both you and the chief say needs to change, or at least start the process of that change?
Yeah, I would go with start. I would definitely go with start the process.
Yeah.
But in order for us to see the deep systemic change that we need to see relative to policing and so many other systems in our country, this nation has to come to grips with its foundation in white supremacy and white primacy. We have to come to grips because when you look at the disparity in terms of perspectives about how abused police power looks to different groups in the country, yeah, it breaks out historically along racial lines because white communities have never suffered that way at the hands of the police. So it's a start, but this nation has a lot of work to do, and it's going to be a difficult task. As you can see, we're in a pitch battle for the soul of the country as we speak, with one side aligning itself with white nationalism and another one embracing the fact that we are an increasingly diverse country and everybody's rights are going to need to be respected.
Reddit, this entire conversation has led lots of black and brown people to say we're over-policed, we're underprotected, and consequently we recommend some meaningful defunding of the police. And that's become quite a flashpoint conversation. How do you think about that debate around defunding the police?
I am in favor of defunding police departments around the country. And when I say defund, I think the term itself is where some confusion can come in. I mean a reallocation of monies in budgets across this country. Here in St. Louis, police department is like 35% of the whole city's budget. Meanwhile, you got houses collapsing in North St. Louis, which is Black St. Louis, schools being closed, up to a dozen of them in the fall in North St. Louis. Meanwhile, historically, what have targeted policing and saturation policing gotten us? Crime has not been reduced significantly. Public safety has not been enhanced significantly. So I think defunding is an important part of the discussion. I would encourage even former President Obama and all of the new administration not to shy away from substantive, deep systemic change. Politically, there's always the fear on the part of those who are in positions to make policy, a backlash from law enforcement, and they want to be seen as supportive of law enforcement. What they need to understand is there are increasingly voices from within the law enforcement community who can support you in the work that you have to do to remake public safety in our country.
Chief, where do you fall on this argument about defunding the police? We did hear former President Barack Obama this week say that it wasn't a helpful phrase and that it wouldn't actually help America get to the kinds of reforms that people like you and Reddit are advocating. What's your view on that issue of defunding the police?
It's a false equivalence. When COVID-19 struck America overnight, they printed $3 trillion to address the issues. If they can do that for COVID, they can do that for communities of color, poor communities, including poor white communities. People shouldn't have to choose one or the other. In our city, our mayor and our council said, no, we're not going to defund. And what they're demanding is that I hold my people accountable, train them appropriately, hold them to high standards, and when they don't live up to the code of conduct and the code of honor, get rid of them.
And do you think, Chief, do you think police forces around the country do a good enough job of exactly what you've described, holding people who don't meet the standards to account?
No, I don't. The truth of the matter is that we have a crisis in leadership. Too many police chiefs see officers that didn't follow their training, that completely didn't do what they were supposed to do, that the use of force may have been technically lawful, but it was an awful use of force, and police leaders that are not holding people accountable. And lastly, this is not Great Britain where you only have a handful of police departments. We have 18,000 police departments with 18,000 sets of policies and procedures. And I can tell you, we probably need to start consolidating police departments. In the St. Louis area, why do you need, every mile and a half, a new city with a new little department, and they're all trying to use the brown and black communities that they serve as taxing authorities by nickel and diming them on every little violation they can find on traffic stops. So it's a complex issue. We're moving in the right direction, but we need the voices of Reddit and Leon and everyone else to continue to push and not let elected officials up off the mat.
Leon, how do you think about this question of defund the police? And or are there other things that you'd like to see considered as policy change and improvement?
Yeah, so I echo what Mr. Hudson said, and I appreciate what Chief has said as well. I'm in these conversations, but what I try not to do is get caught up in the rhetoric on social media. What typically happens is you have activists talking to activists, police officers talking to police officers. You have, different mayor's offices talking to within the mayor's office and to other politicians. I'm just, trying to bring all these different communities together where we can be open and honest with each other. And until we can do that, we'll get lost in the rhetoric.
Chief, I want to bring you back in here. Some of the Pew Research Center studies say that a majority of the American people believe that police do act in the public's best interest. But when you actually unfurl that along racial lines, whites are much more optimistic than Black and Latinx respondents. Talk to me about your optimism. Where are you seeing good policing, and what points us forward to a better space 2 years from now, 4 years from now, 10 years from now?
Well, that's a great question. I'm blessed to lead the Houston Police Department that, again, let's be real clear. I've had to run out over 200 officers since I've been here. But I also get to see the other side, the flip side of that coin is when officers do the right thing and they're just doing phenomenal things. And I think that what's given me hope is that finally this is not a black and brown and poor issue. We're starting to see entities and organizations and people that are white people and people that are affluent people marching with Black Lives Matter over the summer. And we're starting to see places like NASCAR banning the Confederate flag. If somebody would have told me that just last year, I would have told them they're crazy. So I am hopeful. This month, I'm meeting with my Black Lives Matter folks here in Houston to talk about how we and they can come together to push the legislature and do some more reform that's desperately needed to not just support our community and get them the policing they deserve, but also to support the good cops by having systems in place that will weed out bad cops and lead to better outcomes for everyone.
One of the issues, when you look at that Pew poll that Carlos was just referring to, one of the areas where public confidence has really declined is in people when they are asked if police departments effectively hold officers to account for misconduct. And only a third of even white Americans think the police do a good job of that. When you ask African Americans, only 12% think the police do a good job of that. And that makes me wonder why more of the good police that you are talking about don't come out to condemn officers who behave badly. We saw you do it in Houston. You stood with protesters. Why don't we see more good police officers come out when something egregious is done and denounce it more publicly?
Can I answer that?
Mr. Hudson.
Yeah, I would say it's based on the culture. If you remember that 15, 15, and 70 breakout I gave you about good officers who will abuse their power, and 70% can go either way depending on who exerts the most influence. Too many times, officers who do come out are marginalized. It can put your very safety at risk. I've got a colleague here who came out repeatedly challenging the department to hold bad actors accountable, and she would get, things in social media from other officers saying they hoped that she bleeds out. If she's ever in trouble on the street, don't call us. That kind of thing. And add to that, you have to deal with the unions around the country who exert a crazy outsized influence on how officers are disciplined, when and where they can be disciplined, how soon they have to give a statement after a critical incident, transparency and disclosure, and all of these things that really ultimately exempt officers, except in the most extraordinary cases, from accountability. And with that knowledge, you do kind of a is it worth it kind of thing.
Chief, let me bring you in on this question. How do you see the unions? Constructive, not constructive?
Well, I think first and foremost, there's a lot of unions. Some are better than others, but historically they have been more often than not constructive. Having said that, one of the things that we need to make sure we do is that we need to bring scrutiny to union contracts. That a lot of folks think police departments negotiate that contract. It's not the police chief. It's not the police department. It's the elected officials that give away management rights. We've got to make sure that the contract ultimately gives the department the ability to run and handle the discipline as the community would expect the police chief to do.
Chief Acevedo, thank you. I know that you have to go, but thank you for giving us your time.
Thank you all. And if you all need anything, give me a holler.
We appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Leon Ford, you've been listening to this conversation. Do you feel any optimism that the culture can change in American policing?
Yes, only because in my city, we are taking those steps. It hasn't changed yet quite from a policy perspective. The difference is, for me is I'm building those relationships. Like a year ago, if you look on my Twitter account, you can see me calling our mayor here in Pittsburgh a racist or saying he doesn't care about black people. Today, I'm able to reach out to him directly and have a conversation and really, share my insight, which also helps him become a better leader for everyone in Pittsburgh.
Reddit, finally, I know as a former police officer, I'm sure you still have friends, you have former colleagues there, and I assume some of them would join you in both your hope for change and your critique of what's going on now. But what else might we hear from some who might disagree from you? If you were to try and share some of the other perspectives that you hear, and what might we hear from those who might push back and disagree with you some?
No, off the top, they would say, what about black on black crime? Why are you complaining about our abuse power when more people in your community are killed by each other than us? That's the go-to. And from there, it extends out to people don't understand what we do. People don't understand our training. People don't understand what it's like to make a split-second decision in any emergency situation. That is the go-to knee-jerk response of officers across the board. There's never any real substantive challenge to the critiques of the department. It's just kind of a tit for tat. Well, you guys kill each other too. And what I would say is that black communities and communities of color around the country, here in St. Louis and everywhere, we do address that issue. We do march on violence in our communities and acknowledge it because we experience it. What we don't ever see on the other side is law enforcement, acknowledging the racism that influences the culture broadly and the abused power and lack of accountability related to it. But I'll say this, relative to training and accountability right now is the best training. Derek Chauvin, the man who murdered George Floyd, spending the rest of his life in prison is not only accountability, and rightfully so, but it would be excellent training for the remaining officers in Minneapolis relative to abused police power. That's how you can't train racism out of people, but accountability changes behavior.
Reddit Hudson, Leon Ford, I really appreciate you both. Thank you so much for joining us. Katty, what a powerful conversation. Maybe our most powerful conversation yet.
Yeah, I thought hearing Leon's story, it was heartbreaking what he has gone through. And I thought what Chief Acevedo picked up from Leon about how he has come out of this with a sense of mission and purpose, not with a sense of hatred.
You know, what is happening with the police department is similar to what we saw with the Catholic Church and the sex scandal over the last 20 years. It was a thing that was covered up. People originally said it's one bad apple, a few bad apples. And now you begin to have significant leaders like the leader of one of the 5 largest police forces, Art Acevedo, saying, look, it's not a few bad apples, even though I wish it was. It's bushels of apples. And it's when that starts to happen that you begin to have some real change, because you can't have real change without a reckoning of the facts. And I think often that reckoning requires a leader on the inside.
Well, I thought Reddit's point at the end about the reason that we need accountability is that it is in itself a good form of training for police officers coming up through the system was one I hadn't thought about, that, you know, the message that then sends to officers as they come onto the police force, this is not okay. Look what will happen to you if you do behave, as the chief said, awfully, was a very powerful point.
Yeah. You know, you've heard me say before, Katty, that I think not only in America but around the world, the tumult that we've seen, the grappling with big systemic issues isn't over, that it's actually just beginning, and that I think the 2020s will be the new 60s, in that there will be lots of debate about love and race and capitalism and work and tech. And I'm hopeful that at the end of that, you know, by the mid-2020s, that we will be in a substantively different place as a country. We'll be back next week, huh?
We will.
That's all we have time for this week. A big thanks to our guests, Leon Ford, Reddit Hudson, and Chief Art Acevedo of the Houston Police Force.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of When Katty Met Carlos, a co-production from the BBC World Service
and OZY Media. And if you've enjoyed this podcast, please write a review, tell a friend, and of course, don't forget to subscribe. Thank you, and we'll see you again next week.